This is Luke Broyles with 21st Century Finance, and today I want to answer one of the most basic questions about Bitcoin, and that is, why should you trust Bitcoin? Why should I trust Bitcoin over my cash or whatever currency that you are dealing with? However, I'm in the United States, so I'm going to be speaking about the US dollar specifically, and a similar criticism or question of, is Bitcoin only backed by trust? So however you put it, it's basically coming down to trust and Bitcoin. Most people don't understand Bitcoin. They don't understand how the system works. They don't understand what you're really buying when you're buying Bitcoin. And so they don't understand why you should trust Bitcoin. And I'll get into that here in just a moment. So let's compare Bitcoin versus cash, and we'll see why we should trust either system as one preference over another. So what we have here is a graphic that I've made comparing, contrasting both cash as well as Bitcoin. Cash here you have in red, and Bitcoin you have here in this light peachy orange. Over here on the left, what I'm calling a promissory energy system is that of cash, fiat currencies, bonds, and the reason it is promissory energy is because it is a form of energy, aka political energy and monetary energy, that is promised. When you buy a bond, you're buying a promise from the U.S. government. When you look at any cash in your wallet, what you see, it says, "In God We Trust," and it's a Federal Reserve note. It's a promise by the Federal Reserve that this note is good for all debt, private and public. So if we read this quote here, I'll just skim through it here. But the Federal Reserve is a fiduciary system, and this isn't unique to the United States. This is true of all fiat currencies in the world, and it's all faith-based. This is a direct quote from the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City member. And so basically you have to have confidence in the currency, and that when you exchange it for goods and services, the person you're exchanging with also has faith that they are going to be able to use it in the future. And so while mass dilution is a harsh word, as long as you have faith, you'll see that it continues to function. So in a way, all forms of money are a sort of dilution, because you can't eat dollars, you can't use dollars. The dollars in your bank account may not technically even exist, since the Federal Reserve said back on March 26th of 2020 that technically banks don't need to have any reserves on hand. It's pretty much all just a bunch of ones and zeros on screens that are created out of thin air that we all trust and have faith that are going to have value in the future. And so what he says here towards the end is that all these Bitcoins, which are virtual currencies, are faith-based. And pretty much everything that Thomas has said here is spot on correct, that the Federal Reserve and cash and fiat currencies are faith-based. But this last sentence here is dead wrong. Now, yes, he makes it's half true in that people have faith in the Bitcoin system and the promise of Bitcoin. However, if we go back to Satoshi Nakamoto, the creator of Bitcoin, back on February 11th, 2009, when he posted this image over here on the right on the peer-to-peer foundation, this is what he said about Bitcoin, and it's different than what Thomas is saying over here. Satoshi said, "I've developed a new open source peer-to-peer eCash system called Bitcoin, completely decentralized with no central server or trusted parties, because everything is based on crypto proof instead of trust." This is where crypto and cryptocurrencies come from. Basically, what you have over here in the bottom right is a system that validates itself on a series of thousands of computers across the world. You don't need to trust that Satoshi has designed it well. You don't need to trust that Bitcoin is going to continue to work. You can run your own node on your own computer or your own system of computers and basically verify that the system works. And the root problem with conventional currency is all the trust that's required to make it work, as Thomas is referring to over here. The central bank must be trusted not to debase the currency, but the history of fiat currencies is full of breaches of that trust. And this is what people don't realize about history, is that a large number of revolutions and conflicts in history actually stem from a series of banking crises or fiat currency crises. Take the French Revolution, for example, or the collapse of the Dutch Empire, or the Portuguese, or the Spanish, or the Chinese. Throughout history, you see hundreds and hundreds of examples of nations and empires that survive for decades or even centuries, or in a couple cases, millennia, and the collapse of a banking system or a monetary system that relies on trust, when that trust breaks down, it begins to collapse very quickly, because if it's only backed by trust, when that trust is gone, nothing is left. So banks must be trusted to hold our money and transfer electronically, but when we lend it out in credit bubbles and everything, we get all sorts of skyrockets of prices, as well as collapses in prices, which erodes trust over time and requires a further centralization away from the private sector to the public sector to increase trust. And so what we have is a distributed system with no single point of failure. That's him referring to Bitcoin. And so that's why it's important to hold your own keys to your Bitcoin, because you're actually holding your own money, and you reduce the amount of trust needed in the system because you're not trusting an exchange or a centralized entity to hold it. And so the big point here that the average person needs to understand, you don't need to understand how it works entirely. However, I encourage you, if you really want to understand it, do learn how it works entirely. But for the average person, what's important is that when you have a fiduciary system, it's backed by promises based on debt and credit and confidence in the U.S. government and the banking sector. And when you buy Bitcoin, you don't have any trust in Bitcoin. You simply have trust in math, and that math works, and the computers are going to continue to reinforce that math with each other. It's not based on trust at all, unlike what's said over here, but instead it's based on verification. And this is why one of the most popular phrases you'll hear in the Bitcoin community is don't trust, verify. And so essentially all forms of assets are one degree or another of trust. For example, when you buy stocks, you have faith in that company that company is going to be reasonable, that they aren't going to be lying on their balance sheet or breaking rules with the SEC or other legal institutions. You have faith in that product. When you buy Apple stock, you have faith that their products are going to be in demand in the future, and that they're going to constrain the supply enough that they're not going to collapse their own prices, etc. So you have faith in the management team, you have faith in marketing, you have faith that your CEO is not going to be caught in some sex scandal or something. So when you buy stocks, you're basically putting faith in that specific company. Or if you buy a stock index, you're putting faith in the aggregate of those said companies, which is why, typically speaking, the larger basket of stocks you buy, the quote-unquote safer it is, because you're diversifying your faith across a large number of corporations. When it comes to bonds and cash over here, you basically have faith in the government, in this case the United States government, and the government's ability to tax its citizens, because for the cash to have value, for the bonds to have value, for the U.S. government to retain and empower and enforce these instruments, you need to have the government be able to collect taxes, enforce its laws, and everything. So you have both faith in the government, and you have faith that the citizens are going to be able to bring in enough income and enough capita per person that the government's going to be able to take a sizable chunk of that. So when you buy bonds and cash, that's basically what you're putting your faith in. And I know that these are typically referred to as quote-unquote risk-free investments. However, I hope that that mistruth is sufficiently eradicated in this video. Real estate also has a certain degree of faith. You have faith that people are going to desire housing, and desire housing in that certain location. That's why location is so very important. And when it comes to Bitcoin, you don't require any faith for the system. Yes, you have a certain degree of faith that other people will recognize that it's a superior system, but when it comes to the asset itself, you don't require any faith. When you buy a piece of real estate, you have faith that the person that sold it to you was truthful on their inspection report, and you have faith in the title of the piece of real estate, that the records are going to be kept clean and clear, and that there's no mistakes there. But with Bitcoin, when you're dealing with computers here, you don't require any faith, because you're dealing directly in a peer-to-peer fashion with the computers and having your nodes validate the system. And this comes down to the ultimate problem here, that you can't trust humans. If you put humans in charge of a system, it's going to become increasingly difficult for them to be truthful in that system. This is what's called the honeypot problem, and that if you have a growing pot of honey, the desire to corrupt the ledger and the desire to corrupt the system become greater and greater. And I'll elaborate on this in just a moment. But basically what you have here is that the further you regulate a system and you centralize the rules of the system, you increase the desire to both corrupt the system as well as the corruption within the system, and this creates a vicious feedback loop where if you corrupt the money, you corrupt the society. If you corrupt the society, you corrupt the money. Now, the rabbit hole goes very deep here. I won't get too deep into this, but I encourage you to look up the years 1971, 1944. These are the two single most important years for monetary history in the last century or so. And what we come down to the bottom here, Bitcoin is the only thermodynamically sound monetary, energy, and weapon system humanity has ever created, which I know that might go over most people's heads, but I encourage you to remember this nature, that Bitcoin is actually three things. It is a system of money, it is a system of energy production and transfer, and it is a form of weapon on a cybersecurity method. And so in the same way we can think of a locomotive being transformational to society 200 years ago, it is actually multiple things. When you have a locomotive, you have a system of mass transit, you have a system of trade and mass that gives rise to the Industrial Revolution, and the locomotive is a weapon of war. If you look back in history, the civilizations that have the train versus those that did not have the train dominated. The train was a weapon of war. You could transport military weapons, cannons, and men and resources to the front lines. And so really the locomotive is three things wrapped in one, and I encourage you to think of the same way here. The Bitcoin is actually three different things. People say, Bitcoin's no good as money, or it's blah, 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 whatever this or that, but people fail to realize what it's even trying to be or what it even is. And the ability to replicate this is exorbitantly small. It's been attempted to be recreated thousands of times, and nobody has been able to do it. Very, very smart people have tried. Nobody has been able to successfully replicate it, and that's why Bitcoin continues to be the largest digital currency out there, because by those that actually understand it, realize it's incredibly difficult to recreate. Now, Henry Ford, back in 1921 here, actually predicted this, believe it or not, even though he didn't have computers or the internet, both of which are necessary for Bitcoin's survival, or at least computers are. He actually predicted this, that we would eventually create an energy currency that was thermodynamically sound, and that doing so would end the majority of wars, which I know sounds crazy to people today, and it sounded crazy 100 years ago. Can only imagine how absurd he sounded then. But this is basically what he predicted, that eventually we would find a way to create a form of currency, aka a series of ones and zeros we exchange our work and our labor for, in a convertible amount of energy units, and in doing so would take a majority of power away from the state and thus reduce the majority number of wars. Now, I know this probably may not be making sense to most people that are new to Bitcoin, and so I want to play this clip here of Michael Saylor, who just explains it so well I can't even attempt to recreate it. His explanation here is just fantastic of what Bitcoin is and why it's unique in this thermodynamic sound.
Bring it on. All right. So you have a very interesting concept, Michael, about Bitcoin being a store of energy in a thermodynamic type of sense. Could you walk us through sort of that metaphor, what you mean by that?
Okay, look, it's totally strange to have a financial instrument which is scarce and capped, because you can print more tech stocks, you can print more bonds, you can mine more gold, you can issue more fiat currency. On the other hand, in the engineering world, when you're designing pneumatic systems or hydraulic systems, nobody ever built a pneumatic system with a leak, a hydraulic system with a leak. Your swimming pool doesn't even work with a leak, right? Everybody knows if there's a leak in the fuselage of the airplane, it's not going to fly, it's going to explode. So, you don't have a leak in a nuclear reactor. You don't have a leak. You ever try to go across the ocean in a ship with a leak? Okay, the idea of a closed system is basic to every freshman in engineering, and I'm an MIT engineer. We talk about something called adiabatic lapse. An adiabatic system is no leak. A closed system is when you have mass in the system that can either leave or can be added, and all you can do is inject energy. And so Bitcoin is the classic textbook closed system. There's 21 million coins, virtual bars of gold in the system. You can't remove any. You can't add any. There's no inflation. And on the other hand, what you can do is you can heat it up. If you're buying Bitcoin above the 4-year or the 200-week moving average, you're heating up the system. If you're buying it below the 200-week moving average, you're cooling down the system. The entire thing's like a massive monetary battery a capacitor. It's storing energy. And what we've done is created a system where I can take $100 million of monetary energy, I can put it into the Bitcoin network, and it'll sit there for as long as you can imagine, and there's no power loss. That's the genius of it. If I told you I was going to inject another million Bitcoin or 2 or 3 million Bitcoin, I'm bleeding off, I'm diluting the energy. And so, when I describe it as a closed system, what I'm saying is for the first time in the history of man, we created a monetary energy network that will store the energy over time with no power loss. We've never had a money. We've never had a thing that could do that. Gold didn't do that. Copper, silver doesn't do that. Fiat doesn't do that. Stocks and bonds don't do that. It's really an engineering breakthrough.
So, and I know that is difficult for people to understand, and it's one of the reasons why Bitcoin is so hard to explain, because not only do you have to understand what it is on a technical sense. Whoops, I'm getting it out of here. Go away. You not only have to understand what it is on a technical sense, but you also have to understand it from an engineering perspective and why it is so unique and why it has any benefit over current systems. And so the important thing to understand here, even if you don't agree with this idea of Bitcoin being sound or whatever, the important thing that you must understand is that these systems can't coexist. Even if you think Bitcoin is a scam and it's going to zero or whatever, you have to understand, even if you think it's a worthless Ponzi scheme, that they can't coexist. If we look here at the US dollar, or you can replace really this with any fiat instrument here, versus Bitcoin over here on the right, these are inherently conflicting systems on a zero-sum game. An economy or prosperity are not zero-sum games, but having a monetary system that is dominant is zero-sum game, which I'll get into that more in here just a second with that slide that I'll get back to. But when you come to the US dollar and fiat, it is inflationary. It has a leak in the system. When you create new money, you are corrupting the ledger of that system, and as Saylor put it, putting a leak in the system. Another way to think about it is an object in orbit around the Earth. If it has a half-life of anything above 0, its eventual end target is going to be Earth. But if it is in perfect orbit, then it will remain in orbit theoretically forever. And so this is why fiat currencies always eventually come down to 0. It's because as soon as you start printing money, as soon as you start debasing the value of that money and creating more, you have just increased the half-life of that currency up from 0. And so its orbit, or its metaphorical orbit, eventually will come back down to Earth. When compared to Bitcoin, it's deflationary and stable. There will only be 21 million Bitcoin. There will never be more, and you can verify that because you don't require human trust to be able to see that for yourself. And so when you have the dollar, you have a broken ledger. It's requiring human trust. It's ever changing. This is one of the reasons why the Federal Reserve and interest rates are such popular topics all the time in the financial world, is because basically the way you can envision it, it is the minister, so to speak, of the U.S. dollar, in this case Jerome Powell or Janet Yellen or someone of that sort, that comes out on the pedestal and declares the price of money and declares the monetary policy of money. And so his opinion really is the most important in the entire financial world, because he gets to decide what the policy of money is. So it requires human trust that these folks are going to do it right. And a spoiler alert is that they are never going to do it right, because they can't. You can't control something as complex as the economy from a centralized entity of humans or a board of humans. It's ever changing. This is why predicting Federal Reserve, people make millions, tens of billions, or hundreds of billions of dollars in successfully predicting the actions of the Federal Reserve. It's because their changes are so drastic and so constant. People need to be able to predict that just to keep up. It's also promissory energy, where again it's based on credit, debt, and promises of the U.S. government and the Federal Reserve. And you're dealing with political power here. If the U.S. government loses its political power on a military stance, then the whole thing falls apart. When you compare that to Bitcoin, instead of having a broken ledger, it's immutable. Every transaction has been verified. It solves the double spend problem, whereas fiat currency is the double spend problem. You have computational verification, where you don't require human trust. It's unchanging versus the changing nature of the dollar. It relies on electricity and converting watts into energy instead of military power and political promises into energy. And it's apolitical versus our currency, which is political in nature and essence. And so a basic way to think about this and summarize it is that the U.S. dollar prefers to keep stable prices over the stability of the system. If you were to think back to 2008, for example, when a simple housing bubble turned into a complete financial crisis in the end of 2008, when Ben Bernanke came in and quote-unquote saved the U.S. economy, he didn't really save the U.S. economy. He simply preferred to keep stable prices and preventing massive collapses in prices or the stability of the system. With the United States passed the Troubled Asset Relief Program, we simply made the system more susceptible when we had endless QE for the last 10, 15 years or so. This is why during the lockdowns of 2020, the system began to unravel so quickly. Yes, there's also the economic factor. However, when it came to credit markets, the reason the Federal Reserve stepped in so quickly to provide additional liquidity, both to the corporate level as well as the average American, is because the system is becoming less stable over time because we prefer to keep stable prices. And this is why it can never work with human intervention, because we always will prefer short-term stability over long-term stability. It's why it always comes back down to zero and its orbit comes back down to Earth. Or compare it to Bitcoin, where Bitcoin prefers the stability of the system over the stability of prices. This is why Bitcoin's price is so volatile, and yet it continues to survive. Bitcoin has collapsed in price 90%, 80%, 70%, 50%, multitudes of times over the last 10 years, and it's very, very short lifespan. And people view this as a negative, whereas people in the Bitcoin space realize that this is actually a symptom of the positive effect, and that Bitcoin does not have any yield, it does not have any way to collapse no matter the price of the system. And this is what makes Bitcoin unique and why everything that's attempting to recreate Bitcoin fails. It's why Hashcash failed and other similar attempts. Is that everything is attempting to keep stability of prices and sacrifice the stability of the system. And this is really what is important here. It's why Bitcoin will remain volatile forever, and why that's actually a good thing that we want. It is better to have short-term volatility of the security of the system. And, people think that this is just something that Bitcoiners say, but we don't really believe it. And I'd encourage you to reconsider that. Us Bitcoiners, we can withstand a 70%, 80%, even a 90% price decline and lose literally zero conviction here. I mean, I'm making this video and Bitcoin is down 70 or 65%, something to that degree. And I'm not even phased. People think that I've sold out or that I'm panicked in any way or I've lost conviction. And I've not at all because I understand the system and I understand how sound it is and how unstable everything else is. And so I encourage you to think of the system and not the price. And this, unfortunately, is a distinction people miss. This distinction is everything. If you're looking at Bitcoin as a price and you are thinking that Bitcoin is unstable because its price is unstable, what you're doing is you are judging a system from within a system, and you are failing to understand that the reason you think that unstable prices equals a lack of stability in the system is because your entire life you've been trained to think that, because that's how political systems work, and that's what happens when you overlay a political system on top of a monetary system. You are thinking that the stability in prices is equivalent to the stability in the system, where that is the polar opposite of what Bitcoin is. And this is what people miss. This is why they think Bitcoin is a bubble when it's skyrocketing or when it's collapsing, when its price is going down. That's not the case. All that matters is the system. Are the computers still working? Is the system still sound? If so, then it is functional, and price on the short term is irrelevant because the system is remaining stable. And so again, these systems cannot coexist. You have one system over here, you have a competing system over here, and they can't coexist. They are inherently polar opposites. And so therefore, one of these two systems must go to zero. There is no other option. This is a fact of the matter. And so we are in this very unique period in history where both systems actually still do exist, and so it's a matter of time until one of them collapses into the other. Either Bitcoin is going to collapse and people are going to prefer stability of prices over stability of system, and it's going to collapse back into the dollar, or the dollar and fiat currency and promissory energy is going to collapse into electrical energy systems. And so one of these two things is going to happen. One way to think of that is think of the horse and the locomotive. I've talked before how on a technological front these things are in a zero-sum game, and that only one of these can survive. In the same way, that's what we're looking at here. You can think of Bitcoin as the locomotive and fiat currency as the horse. Either the horse is going to decline forever for the rest of time, and the locomotive will play an increasing role in transportation across the world, or the vice versa scenario will happen, and that the locomotive is going to fail in one regard or another. Maybe it's not economically viable, as a long-term transit system, and eventually we default back to the horse. That's how you can think of Bitcoin here. These things are not going to coexist. It's why people have such a difficult time thinking of Bitcoin in terms of the dollar. They don't really understand how Bitcoin fits in the current world, and that's because Bitcoin doesn't fit in the current world. It fits in the future world. It's a necessary component of the future of humanity, whereas the horse, frankly, is not. And so this is one way to think about the different eras of monetary history. You have relational energy back here in prehistory and early history, where everything is basically social credit and relationships and small tribes and villages and communities. And then you have an energy transition down here in roughly the 2500s BC, where we converted to caloric energy, where instead of trading faith with each other, we traded commodities such as grains or salts or other sorts of food. And so what you have here is the underlying energy of the system, as well as the denomination of that system. When you have wheat or grains or salts, these things degrade over time. They become more and more dilute, less and less valuable as a function of time. And this system is a 100x improvement over space, 10 times better over time than the previous system. But then we upgraded to the next system, aka gold. Roughly in the 500s BC. It's a better improvement over time because it's much more difficult to create new gold than, say, new food. There's much lower ability to, because it's far more scarce. But then we upgraded again to what we've had for roughly the last 1,000 years or so, where we've had promissory energy, where the world is based on debt, credit, bonds, and pieces of paper that nations and empires and colonies exchange with each other. And while this is a much, much better improvement over space, because you can trade paper very easily, where it's very difficult to exchange gold on a day-to-day basis or in very large quantities or to store it over time, this is much worse over time. Fiat currencies have a tendency to decay much, much faster than, say, the value of gold. And I don't have to get into that. That should be pretty obvious to everyone. And now this is what we're experiencing here in the 21st century. That's why I'm calling this channel 21st Century Finance, and why this century is so pivotal. It's because we're transitioning from this previous system of monetary and political energy, of promissory energy, and we're just upgrading to electrical energy via proof of work consensus via computers. And what's unique about this system is that, as you can see, for the first time in history, we have an underlying denomination of currency here that becomes more and more valuable over time, because for the first time we have a digital system that actually can verify scarcity. And so even though it's a 100x improvement over space compared to this previous system, it is infinitely better over time, and it is genuinely infinitely better. Again, think back to orbits. All of these systems have a half-life. Granted, the half-life of gold is much longer than, say, promissory energy or caloric energy, but when you have a deflationary system here, or right now disinflationary system of Bitcoin, it's the polar opposite. It becomes more scarce and more valuable over time. And so the whole point here is that these things cannot coexist. You cannot have a deflationary and an inflationary system. You cannot have a system based on verification and trust at the same time. And one of the people I recommend most to explain this disparity is Jeff Booth. He has an incredible book out there called The Price of Tomorrow. It's not even really about Bitcoin. It's about the collision of technology and central banking. And this is a clip I want to end on here that I think is really solid for making the point.
And this affects everything. You have these collision of two giant forces. Technology on one side, wanting to free our time. If you think about money just as a concept, it's an abstract concept for our time. And we use technology to give us more time. That's why we use it. We could dig holes with spoons. We don't, because we save time with technology. And that technology is now transferred to a point, largely because of those folds, to a point that it doesn't look like it used to. It's moving so fast, and it changes everything. And you have central banking, and I could have put inflation here or central banking. I'm not trying to do this to push, to say it's any person's fault. That's really important. It's a mistake of unable to grasp what's happening with technology in a system that's reinforcing itself, and those systems cannot work together. They're polar opposite systems. So what would it look like if you tried to drive inflation in a massively deflationary world? And think about what inflation is. We don't even question it. We say an economy requires inflation. Has anybody asked themselves why? Is there a rule that says we can't live in a productive society without money losing its value every year? Because 2% inflation is really just a theft that transfers money to the wealthy from the poor. And so we don't question the 2% inflation, or is that okay? Or 5% inflation isn't okay? 20% is it? We don't question. We don't say the rate of theft is okay or not. So you have a fraud based into the monetary layer. And I understand why when I say the fraud, those are harsh words. But it's why? Because you, me, everybody will always vote to get more than we can actually get. So we'll vote in people who tell us this little lie that we can pay for something that we can't.
And that's the crux of the argument there, that when you put humans in control of a financial system, you are always going to have the system be corrupted. Even if you put in righteous and perfect and holy leaders in the forefront of the system, eventually you're going to have the population vote for their own demise, and that they're going to want something for free today that they can't actually get because they're creating it out of thin air. And this is why Bitcoin is so unique in its regard. If you give humans control of a system that has exponentially increasing financial incentive to corrupt said system, it will be corrupted. This has happened every time in history. It's already happened to every fiat currency today, and it's only going to get worse as a function of time. And so if we take 3 takeaways here, the Bitcoin becomes exponentially more difficult to corrupt the larger it gets, because you have more and more computers validating the system. It becomes exponentially more difficult to hack, to censor it, or shut down. And second, the Bitcoin has endured immense battles already, such as the block size wars, trying to ban it 5 times already and failing every single time, etc., legal stipulations and everything like that. Bitcoin has already defeated those, despite being 100 times smaller and less secure than it is today, and it's going to be 100 times bigger a few years from now than it is today. And this is probably never going to be recreated again, because we've seen it, and once humans are aware of it, it's very, very difficult to recreate. It's been attempted to its recreation has been attempted hundreds, thousands of times actually, not hundreds of thousands, hundreds and thousands of times, and every single time has failed. Bitcoin has been the only one to successfully do that and achieve the vision that Henry Ford had over a century ago. And so if these 3 statements are true, then everything is going to zero against Bitcoin as a function of time. Everything has a half-life, and its orbit is coming back down to Earth, and Bitcoin is the only thing we've invented that is not going to do so. Real estate, stocks, bonds, cash, everything is going to zero against Bitcoin. And this is why Bitcoin is often called a black hole, or a singularity, so to speak, and that it has infinite mass if you compare it to that of a black hole in a certain aspect. And so the important takeaway for you, even if this doesn't make sense yet, you don't have to sell everything right now and buy Bitcoin. You don't have to freak out right now and buy Bitcoin. But I encourage you to start learning as soon as possible, because every single year you wait, it will become only more and more difficult to transition. Because back in 2010, Bitcoin was $1. In 2014, it was $100. In 2017, it reached $10,000 for the first time. Probably by the end of this decade or early next decade, so say early 2030s or so, Bitcoin will be $1 million, roughly speaking. And perhaps, 10, 15 years later from that, it'll be $100 million. I know these prices sound extremely exorbitant to people today. Oh, there's not enough money in the world to get to these prices. If Bitcoin did that, I have to go to blah, blah, blah. And that's kind of the whole point. People often say, oh, there's not enough money in the world to get to these absurd prices. And they're right. And that's the whole thesis, is that more money is going to be created. These systems will continue to be diluted because these systems have leaks in them. And so really there is no price cap on the price of Bitcoin. That's why people often call it infinity over 21 million, because there's an infinite amount of cash at the Federal Reserve. And this is actually a quote by Alan Greenspan. But there's an infinite amount of cash at the Federal Reserve. There's an infinite amount of assets humanity will be able to create, and our ability to create energy is going to continue to get exponentially better. The marginal cost of energy is going to zero, and so there's an infinite amount of value, an infinite amount of cash, and an infinite amount of assets that are going to be divided by 21 million Bitcoin. However, there's really only about 2 to 4 million Bitcoin left, depending on how you define it. And so while everything continues to decline in real purchasing power, Bitcoin will go up in purchasing power theoretically forever, and until we invent a system that is significantly better than Bitcoin. However, it's been 14 years, there have been thousands of attempts, and nothing has been able to do it. And when this happens, the thermodynamically sound system that has the longest time chain, the longest blockchain, is probably going to win anyway. So even if we recreate Bitcoin perfectly today, it is almost certain to not succeed with the original Bitcoin, or in light of the original Bitcoin. It's been hard for it many times, and every single one has failed. So exponential debasement coupled with a thermodynamically sound energy storage system, and this energy storage system being Bitcoin here, something that requires no trust, and because instead works on verification versus the exponential debasement of the US dollar. Basically, everything with a price in the US dollar is trending towards zero as a function of time. And so my encouragement to you is to continue learning about Bitcoin and get off zero. It's never too late to understand this. When it's $1 million, when it's $100 million, if it happens to be even more expensive in the future, almost certainly, it'll always be cheap to a certain regard, because there is no limit to how much of everything will be able to be created. So I encourage you to not feel too bad that you missed it at these low prices of $1, $100, and $10,000, and instead realize what the system is, what it's going to do for the future of humanity, and that pretty much what we're looking at here is a moment similar to the invention of the locomotive. So I encourage you just to get off zero, learn more about it, and I have extreme confidence that the more you learn about it, the more and more you are going to buy, and the less and less of everything else you are going to want to own.